So I know I said after the last video that the next video was going to be about how they were going to create a global citizenry through technology-based global curriculum and assessments, but I felt like it was important right after that castle video to talk about second step. And today's video is super important. It is literally the genesis of how I got started being involved in all of this. I saw on a board agenda 2 words: implicit bias, which we talked about in our last video, and microaggressions. Implicit bias is the concept that because, critical race theorists feel that the system is set up to oppress people of color. And if you're a white person and you grow and thrive in this system that you benefit from, that you automatically want to keep the status quo and therefore have implicit bias and are racist toward people of color. And microaggressions is, doing things like touching people's hair or saying, wow, you're really articulate, and people assume that because they're a person of color that you're saying, you wouldn't have said that to a white person, and therefore it's like these tiny little, like, you don't mean to hurt them, but you're being offensive. That's what that microaggressions means, but it was under this whole umbrella of responsive services. And as a part of that behavioral support, they were implementing this curriculum called Second Step. And I said, well, what's that? And I went to their website, and, really this video is going to kind of walk you through all the things I found just on my own. And then something crazy happened. Right before I gave my presentation to Utah Parents United in August of 2021, a teacher actually quit at the school that my child goes to over having to teach this curriculum. And before that, I had gone to the school. I had said, hey, I want to see everything you have on Second Step. And they laid out all the books on the table, and I went and I spent hours there looking through just these booklets basically of all of the worksheets. And they never told me there was a video component to this. And I did not find that out until the teacher quit, because he mentioned that there was an introductory video that was showing a BLM march and a candlelight vigil for a school shooting, and also had language basically saying like, hey, kids, other generations don't know what you're going through. Your parents, your grandparents, they can't understand. And it was that moment that I knew I had to go in and do a deep dive. The problem is these curriculums are not transparent. They are copyrighted, so no one can view them from the comfort of your home. You have to go into the district office and have an administrator log you in to look at them. And B, they can be updated at any time. And in our district, there was no policies in place to re-review curriculum they had approved once it was changed online. And so it could be changed to anything and no one would vet it. Once I found out about the video component, another parent and I, Stacey Clayton, decided, you know what, we're going to go into the district office. We're going to sit there for hours and we're going to go through this. And we did. We spent over 30 hours going through the 8th grade curriculum alone. And we put out 2 reports to help other parents. It was a 25-page report that had literally everything in it, right? We just went over every single lesson and how it was taught and, whether or not we had concerns with it. And then we put out a 3-page document that summed everything up by topic. The fact that parents weren't put in a positive light, the fact that they were teaching elements of comprehensive sex ed, the fact that they were heavily pushing for our students to become social justice activists for particular causes. I will link in the description to Stacey and I's reports. And I hope that just talking about where they're coming from and seeing what Second Step and the parent company Committee for Children are all about will give you a clue as to whether or not you should opt your child out of their curriculum. So hope you enjoyed this video.
Second Step is a social emotional learning program put out by the parent company Committee for Children.
Just so it's clear, CASEL, who we talked about in the last video, is the organization that sets the standards for SEL, and programs like Second Step or others like it adhere to those standards in their implementation. Committee for Children is a global nonprofit which was originally formed in 1979 to help victims of child sexual abuse. They went on to develop curriculum for child protection as well as bullying prevention through social-emotional learning called Second Step. It is one of the most widely used curriculums across the nation, reaching more than 20.5 million elementary and middle school students a year, probably including some of yours. The first thing I did when I heard this program was going to be taught at my child's school was go to their website and poke around. It didn't take me long to get to this page, which lists anti-racial and anti-bias resources for the teachers to supplement their Second Step lessons with. Many, if not all, of the resource links go to websites which tout the critical race theory tenet of systemic racism. They literally say there in that top paragraph that they will help educators teach SEL in a way that, quote, critically examines systems of power. Remember, if you're white, the critical race theorists believe this system is set up to oppress people of color and give you more power and privilege. They also say that they subscribe to CASEL's new definition of transformative SEL, which I covered extensively in Sinister SEL Part 3, which heavily advocates for teaching social and emotional learning through this racial and equity lens. They mention here that engaging in this form of SEL is challenging because it pushes people to, quote, question long-standing beliefs, assumptions, and policies, but it is necessary to move toward a more just and equitable future, end quote. Of course it is. The goal of this type of SEL is to funnel students into a racial and critical consciousness to encourage them to become anti-racist. Again, the term anti-racist isn't defined as what you probably think it is, which is not racist. Because of course all of us would agree that's a good thing. In their eyes, simply being not racist does not require active resistance to and dismantling of the system, which they feel is set up and operates in such a way to purposely oppress people of color. Being anti-racist does, and they want to use SEL to turn your children into social justice activists toward that cause. Don't just take my word for it. Here's Committee for Children telling you themselves in a webinar titled Using SEL to Create Equitable Schools.
And with this incredible reach comes responsibility to ensure that our programs are helping children develop healthy racial identities and preparing them to lead the future, which means providing research-based, equity-centered SEL. We began our own internal equity journey a few years back, and we've been striving towards transformative SEL ever since. Transformative SEL is a term coined by CASEL that is defined as a process whereby young people and adults build strong, respectful, and lasting relationships that facilitate co-learning to critically examine root causes of inequity and to develop collaborative solutions that lead to personal, community, and societal well-being. The field of SEL has always emphasized the need for explicit skill building to develop social-emotional competencies such as emotion awareness, coping skills, and friendship skills. But more recently, there's been a movement in the field to focus on the learning experiences that young people and adults need to develop strong, positive relationships, to engage in critical reflection about themselves and society, with the ultimate goal being to help develop solutions for healthier individuals and healthier communities. In our efforts to promote transformative SEL at CFC, we've curated a set of teaching tolerance lessons that are aligned to our Second Step elementary and middle school programs that we believe help to create these spaces for developmental experiences. Teaching Tolerance is a social justice and anti-bias focused organization that provides free resources to educators. And they've designed a robust set of lessons with direct instruction around the 4 pillars of anti-bias education, which are identity, diversity, justice, and action. So this is an example of our Teaching Tolerance and Second Step elementary alignment. And what you'll find in this PDF are individual teaching tolerance lessons that are hyperlinked in the document. So the column to the far left has the title of the teaching tolerance lesson. Then we also have the CASEL and social emotional competency. That is really the foundation for the lesson. The social justice domain, so that would be identity, diversity, justice, and action that the lesson really speaks to. And then for the elementary program, for some of these lessons, we have specific second step lessons that we recommend teaching them with. And for others, we just identify lessons that really fit well with our curriculum. And so we recommend teaching these teaching tolerance lessons along with your second step implementation, with your second step lessons as the foundation.
You heard her mention there the Teaching for Tolerance, now called Learning for Justice, alignment that can be taught with second step. They are basically a set of lessons with direct instruction on identity, diversity, justice, and action that, in their words, are supposed to complement and enhance social and emotional skills. Second Step recommends teaching these lessons in tandem with the second step implementation to, quote, incorporate diversity, equity, and social justice work into SEL lessons. It's easy to see that Learning for Justice's website is full of anti-white racism. In fact, much of Second Step's YouTube channel shows their critical race theory views in action. Their trainings and webinars reveal their agenda to incorporate adult SEL with the goal to train administrators and educators to be community organizers who will in turn want to teach their students to be social justice activists. In this presentation, Using SEL to Create Equitable Schools, Committee for Children representatives talk about using SEL and specifically the resources provided for teachers and administrators through their Second Step program to, quote, correct systemic oppression and inequities for people of color.
So we put together a list of resources for all educators with 4 goals in mind. The first one is to help educators understand the history and the context of educational inequities. What is the landscape of equity in education? How did these systemic inequities come about? The second goal is to help educators develop knowledge of their students' cultures and histories. So this is a first step in what's called cultural literacy, and we've curated a set of books and documentaries to help you build this cultural literacy. So third, there is a huge amount of research on the role of implicit or unconscious bias and how it plays out in the classroom without us even being aware of it. So on our resources site, what you'll find is a digestible but comprehensive review of the research on implicit bias in the classroom. And we also provide a link to Harvard's implicit project where you can take the original implicit bias test. Then, for educators who are ready for action, we provide some resources to help you to do just that. So some of you who are watching this have probably been on this equity journey for a long time, and you may be feeling ready and eager to put it into action. So we'll link to some guidance about what exactly a culturally responsive classroom looks and feels like. And we also link to some free resources and some training on how you can bring this to bear in your daily interactions with your students and how you design your lessons and how you design your classroom. Social emotional programs when they're done in a culturally responsive way, and restorative practices that de-emphasize punishment and emphasize skill building and relationship repair show promise for correcting systemic inequities for students of color. The resources lay out a framework for the intersection of equity and SEL. What does it mean to do transformative SEL? How can the two strands of work be braided so that they support each other and are not in competition with each other? The second goal is to give you some specific resources that outline the policies and practices that reduce systemic inequities. As leaders, you have to lead your staff in this work. So we've also added some resources to help you engage in conversation and in coaching around equity issues.
Also listen to this gem from their presentation, Disrupt the Status Quo, How SEL Can Address Implicit Bias and Build Equity.
We all want to do what's best for our students. And the way to get there is to really look at self-reflection, to look inward at ourselves, to deal with our implicit bias issues. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that's going to make us better in the classroom.
No one who's been born and raised in the United States is immune from inheriting the implicit bias of our ancestors.
Oh, it's true.
And that's just it. And he said, you're all victims, and we cannot avoid it any longer. We have to address it.
We do, and I think that is why we are having what I'm calling kind of a national reckoning on race, because we have not dealt with it. We have kind of swept it under the rug. It's been too uncomfortable. We didn't want to face it. And now everybody's at home. Mm-hmm. Everybody's looking at CNN, and we have no choice. And so now we're dealing with it. And it's good. It's good that we need to do that because it's going to make us better as a country, and it's going to be better for the next generation that comes up.
It will, but there will be those who will say, I don't want to give up my white privilege. I don't want to make the change because I've been comfortable, right?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, is helping everyone to recognize this is good for everyone.
It's hard if you've been in a position of power to give up that power. And I am going to share. I know you're going to get copies of the PowerPoint after we're done here today, but I do have a reading list that I've compiled that I'll be happy to share that has podcasts and books and all kinds of different things for students, for you if you're interested in learning more. Just from a standpoint of doing the exploration and doing the work to do that self-reflection that I'm going to be talking about with you.
The truth is everyone has implicit bias. An implicit bias is an unconscious association, belief, or attitude toward any social group. Due to implicit biases, people may often attribute certain qualities or characteristics to all members of a particular group, a phenomenon known as stereotyping. Again, the way they are using the term implicit bias comes from the Marxist ideology that race is a social construct or something that is made up in society used to exploit people of color. Critical race theorists hold that racism is inherent and exists in all the institutions and systems of the United States. They believe those institutions and systems function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. And if you're a white person, because you exist and thrive within this racist institutional or structural framework, then they believe you naturally want to keep the status quo to sustain your white power and privilege, and are racist or have implicit bias toward people of color. In general, race is a primary factor Second Steps program focuses their bullying lessons on. It shouldn't surprise you that they cite power and privilege as one of the three main social factors for bullying. Now, they don't come right out and say that white people are the ones with the most power and privilege. What they do is much more subtle. Throughout the cartoons and videos shown in the lessons, they primarily show white people in the role of the aggressor and people of color in the role of the victim to cement the association that it is in fact white people who have the most power and privilege. Second Step's introductory video for their middle school curriculum shows a Black Lives Matter protest.
The world is changing, maybe more dramatically than ever. School is different for you than it was for your teachers and parents. You're facing issues other generations didn't have to think about. You see and hear about problems of injustice and suffering that are hard to ignore, especially when they affect you directly.
They instruct students to choose a disruption strategy, complete with the cartoon imagery of the raised fist symbolism of Black Lives Matter and Black Power. Lest I remind you that Black Lives Matter is an organization who admitted on their website they wanted to disrupt the nuclear family structure, and who is run by people who admit that they are trained Marxists. Besides race, Second Step also focuses heavily on gay and transgender issues when discussing bullying and harassment. These lessons do not simply list these areas as reasons students are bullied. Rather, these reasons are prioritized over others in the lessons.
There were a couple guys who rode my bus and just spent the entire time throwing around like homophobic slurs and talking about how much they like hated and feared and felt disgusted by gay people.
When I came to school in September, it was a lot of conversations. People would ask their friends like, oh, is that a boy or a girl? Or like, what is that boy wearing? Or like, is that boy wearing a skirt? Just really ignorant things that I found to be really offensive and really hurtful. And it made learning very difficult. And it made just walking from class to class very difficult, and staying happy and keeping my grades up difficult.
People would just call me like gay and like names and stuff, and people would just like pick on me and just left me out of like things.
I felt
really bad for the person they were talking about, and it kind of just made me feel like, wow, these people are really mean.
It lets people know that school is a place where there is this type of judgment and where people are going to judge you for how you express yourself and are going to talk about it and are going to perpetuate these stigmas, and I don't think that's okay at all.
It's hard to see people who might be different to be picked on like that. I like to see different because that's what makes us human.
The program encourages students to accept these ideologies to a point they are willing to defend them. This goes further than just teaching children that they should be accepting and inclusive of people that are different than them by treating everyone with kindness. It could also be noted that focusing on gender and sexual orientation in lessons where sensitive topics are discussed as a class may expose students to ideas and concepts that go against parental consent and familial or religious beliefs. For example, in one suggested advisory activity, students are assigned a service project in which they will, quote, work to reduce sexual or gender harassment so everyone in their community can feel safe and accepted, end quote. Students must identify the effects that sexual and gender harassment have on people in the community, then investigate ways they can help support people who experience sexual or gender harassment by starting a public awareness campaign, writing letters to newspapers, or supporting a community organization. As a part of one lesson plan, teachers need to have a list ready of organizations that are active in the community to help students expand their investigation into volunteering, and in another, teachers are told to, quote, have a list ready of community organizations that support people who experience sexual or gender harassment, end quote. Since the Second Step program strongly advocates for gay and transgender issues, as well as Transformative SEL, which promotes the tenets of critical race theory, both of these situations open the door for teachers who feel inclined to suggest organizations to students with a particular political lean and ideological agenda. Some other phrases found throughout the 8th grade lessons that encourage activism are stand up and speak out, decide how you put your disruption strategy into action, start a social movement in your community or online by leading a discussion, making a poster, or starting a hashtag on social media, and stand up for change. The program even covertly tries to slip in suggestive ideas, like in this 6th grade lesson, where one of the examples of specific goals they could make was to, quote, work for a social justice organization, slipped ever so subtly between graduate from high school and learn one new dance routine this month. I don't know about you, but when I was 11, working for a social justice organization was nowhere on my radar. In 7th grade, Second Step introduces the idea of consent, a common theme of comprehensive sexuality education, by stating that the difference between sexual harassment and flirting is whether words or actions were welcome or not. Students were asked to clarify whether or not being shown pictures of a sexual nature at school was sexual harassment or flirting. And the message wasn't that it was always wrong for someone to do that, but the category it fell in was determined by if it bothered you. The final and most egregious thing that Stacy and I discovered during our review of the 8th grade curriculum was that there were 2 third-party links recommended to 7th and 8th graders that were not within the bounds of Utah sex education laws. The links loveisrespect.org and rain.org violated parental consent, and if followed, would have exposed 12 and 13-year-olds to inappropriate sexual content. Those websites led them to other websites, like Planned Parenthood and Scarleteen, where they could learn how to have a safe, self-managed medical abortion. Those links were removed by Second Step this past October of 2021. But it was that revelation that made our superintendent immediately put the program on hold until they could figure out if they were going to scrap the program completely. Some board members wanted to just get rid of the middle school curriculum and keep the K-5. Don't worry, I did a deep dive into that too. I looked for common themes that would naturally lead the students to the conclusions Second Step desired them to come to by 8th grade. I found quite a few examples, and while they may not be as obvious as the ones that were discussed for the middle school curriculum, it does not make them any less harmful. The elementary curriculum is grooming the students through tried and true propaganda techniques. What tipped me off was that Committee for Children literally admits on their blog that they want to use their implementation of social and emotional learning to promote allyship. The lessons introduce many of the terms found on allyship websites, such as walk in their shoes. This is a song they play in almost every lesson. Recognizing your blind spots. This is a 4th grade lesson on recognizing your blind spot. And listening with attention. Empathy and perspective taking are 2 of the main areas in social emotional learning that Second Step focuses on and is mentioned continuously throughout the lessons K through 5. While the ability to have empathy and take others' perspectives are helpful tools to have to build healthy relationships, they are not the only tools. Knowing what Second Step has planned for social justice activism, the push to emphasize these 2 elements above all the others lines up with their stated purpose. In this article, Taking the Empathy to an Activist State, Allied Development as Continuous Cycles of Critical Understanding and Education, the development of empathy and perspective taking are mentioned as, quote, key things that lead to social justice activism and allyship. In fact, the definition of empathy and perspective taking change over the course of the lessons in K through 5. Empathy starts out as feeling or understanding what someone else is feeling. Later in the lessons, students are told to accept and acknowledge people's preferences and perspectives. Acceptance, according to Oxford Dictionary, is to believe or come to recognize an opinion, explanation, etc. as valid or correct. And acknowledge, according to Merriam-Webster, means to say that you accept or do not deny the truth or existence of something. This goes beyond just understanding what someone else is feeling and into the realm of taking the other person's perspective onto oneself. Considering that the Second Step program heavily promotes LGBTQIA activism, including that for transgender students, it makes me question whether this kind of language, especially the choice of the word preference, and their continued assertion that, quote, feelings change, is laying the groundwork for them to later accept controversial topics like gender theory. In order to believe in things like gender theory, students must be primed to question objective reality. This 1st grade lesson seems to do just that.
This time we have a new rule. You're going to ignore the shape drawn on the card and only pay attention to its color. The color tells you the move to make. So this is what the colors mean. Blue means circle, okay? And then red means the triangle, and green means square, okay? So again, blue means circle, red, all right, now remember, circle, and you see a blue, green, okay. So what skills did you use to ignore the shape on the card and only pay attention to the color? Moses.
Self-talk, and I also had to use my head because it wasn't cooperating, so I had to use my head and not listen.
Good. Natalie.
Pretend the shape's not there.
Pretend the shape's not there. Okay. Jaden.
Self-talk and remember the rules.
Yes. Good. Okay. So you really had to use all your learning skills on this game.
Yeah.
The first objective of this lesson is to get the students to ignore what they see, reality, what's on those cards, and let the teacher's instructions or human interaction guide them. Anyone who is versed in the tenets of critical race theory, Marxism, and gender theory could recognize that they are introducing the students to the concept of social constructionism, which is the idea that everything exists not as a part of objective reality, but because humans agree that it exists. For them, everything people know or see as reality is partially, if not entirely, socially situated. For the Marxists, it's class. For the gender theorists, it's gender. And for the critical race theorists, it's race. They believe those socially situated constructs are set up to give power and privilege to one set of people to oppress another set of people, whether it be the working class, people of color, or people who assert they have a different gender or sexual identity. Another objective of this lesson is teaching students to counteract their own internal beliefs and associations, for instance, that a blue square does not equate to a circle. It is theorized that people can learn to counteract biases by using visual or verbal cues to develop new associations. To evaluate implicit bias, scientists mostly use tests that measure reaction time and rely on the idea that if we closely associate 2 concepts in our minds, they'll be easy for us to sort together. And if we don't associate them, they'll be harder and take more time to sort together. It's called the Stroop effect. The most popular of these tests to measure implicit bias is the implicit association test. Theoretically, though, this method can also be used to implant associations that didn't exist in the first place. I just showed you a second ago that in 8th grade SEL lessons, they'll be taught that pride and privilege are one of the 3 main social factors for bullying, and then be shown cartoon images with white children as aggressors and people of color as victims. Similar to that implicit association test, students will be led into creating associations that will condition them to believe that white people naturally have implicit bias, power, and privilege, and are racist toward people of color regardless of what they think to be true in reality. Second step says that having empathy helps you show compassion, or empathy in action, and that compassion is a way to show you have empathy. Compassion is defined as, quote, saying kind words or doing something helpful to show you care about how another person feels, end quote. Does that mean you don't have empathy if you don't say or do something for someone? They specifically mention that students who are bullied can experience fewer difficulties if other students are compassionate and show them support. Increased empathy may also decrease student support of others' bullying and make students more likely to help those who are mistreated. And that's all fine and good. But they also assert that indifferent responses, like hostile responses, are not empathetic. They encourage students to notice rather than ignore classmates who may be struggling or in need of help, and then to offer support. And while we should always teach our children to be kind to those who are hurting, these statements are reminiscent of the social justice rhetoric that proclaims that in order to not be a racist, you actually have to be an anti-racist or activist. Knowing that social justice activism is pervasive in Second Step's middle school curriculum, these statements go right along with that narrative. They also present an altered version of the golden rule, considering how someone would like to be treated and then treating them that way. This is actually not the golden rule, which is to treat others how you would like to be treated. With the heavy LGBTQIA lean in the Second Step middle school curriculum, this kind of interpretation could be used to eventually encourage students to be forced to use other people's stated pronouns or accept sexual variants. Another problem with Second Step, and really most social emotional learning programs, is that students are encouraged to share sensitive information while either partnered up or in a group setting. Many classrooms start their SEL studies with a circle time that is akin to group therapy without a licensed professional. For instance, in a Second Step 3rd grade lesson, students practice focusing attention and listening as classmates relate times where they felt upset. In 4th grade, students are asked whether or not they've experienced anger, embarrassment, jealousy, or fear at the same time, and to discuss that with their peers. Those are just 2 of many examples of this in the curriculum. Having students be vulnerable about their feelings in a group setting can literally open Pandora's box without providing the guardrails that exist in a therapy setting to protect the student or provide the clarity or closure they might need. Dr. Laura Sanger, a licensed clinical psychologist, is one of the few professionals sounding the alarm about this in SEL in general. The whole video is worth watching, but I'm just going to play you a clip.
Now, the intent of SEL is to expose our students' beliefs, attitudes, and values. And they do that through activities, assignments, and surveys for the purpose of reshaping our students' attitudes, beliefs, and values so that it aligns with that which is deemed acceptable by teachers, administrators, and school board members. Now, there are 3 domains of SEL. They are cognitive skills, emotional competence, and social and interpersonal skills. Well, as a psychologist, I highly value those domains. In fact, those are precisely the areas that I use to address with my clients in therapy. But it's critical the context in which these domains are addressed because it can either lead to transformation or indoctrination. So, for example, in the context of therapy, psychologists are bound by ethical standards in which we cannot insert our own biases into the therapeutic relationship. It would be unethical for me to try and persuade my clients to adopt my worldview. Also, psychologists and mental health counselors, we're the ones that are trained to implement psychological interventions. We know how to develop a safe therapeutic environment that can lead to transformation. Within the context of a classroom, teachers are not bound by that same ethical standard, so they don't have any guardrails that are preventing them from inserting their own biases into the curriculum. Unfortunately, what we find, it's become common practice for teachers to try and persuade their students to adopt their worldview, and that's what leads to indoctrination. SEL also encourages teachers to utilize psychological interventions to help students understand their attitudes, beliefs, emotions, even in managing their emotions. And so teachers that use SEL are actually encouraged to practice psychology without a license. This is not only troublesome, this is against the law. And that's why I'm trying to get more psychologists to speak out about this. And let me give you an example. A 4th grade teacher in a local school here in Utah was teaching on the subject, the SEL topic of empathy. And so the activity was to have her students sit down in a circle and share what they find to be sad. So students began sharing kind of the typical things like my goldfish died or my dad lost his job. But there was one student who shared, my parents got divorced, my mom is drinking and seeing other people. Well, this triggered a cascade of events where students began sharing more and more sensitive material with each other, to the point where it was reported that most of the students were crying. Then by the end of the 20-minute exercise, the teacher said something flippant like, well, life is hard, let's get out our math books. And so what this highlights is that teachers are not trained to be able to use psychological interventions. Here, this teacher's exercise unraveled these students emotionally, and she didn't have the training to know how to bring them back to a place of emotional stability. Well, the repercussions of this can be felt for hours, days, and weeks later within the child's life. So this is precisely why we don't want our teachers practicing psychology.
Because of all these aforementioned issues, I recommended to the board and the superintendent that we get rid of Second Step entirely, K through 8, and not even use it in the interim, which they wanted to do with the elementary curriculum, while trying to figure out how to best meet the social and emotional needs of the students in our district. Why should we expose the minds of our children to a program we know wants to indoctrinate them, subtly or not so subtly? Thanks for joining me today to watch this video. I hope it really opened your eyes as to what Second Step is teaching, and how honestly, any curriculum that is choosing to say that they're teaching Castle's Transformative SEL, there should be red flags going up for you folks. There is a happy ending to this story. After months of trying to open our school district board members' eyes and getting our community riled up, Stacy and I were able to be victorious in a 4-3 vote. They voted Second Step out, and it took a lot, but it was worth it. And I remember a parent calling me and saying, do you know that you've made a difference for thousands of students? They may have been indoctrinated by this program. Many of you say, I'm just one parent, what can I do? But let me just tell you, you can do a whole lot. If little old me can start what I've started here in Utah and across the country, then you can too. You can fight back. You can open people's eyes. And so, thank you again for your support, and hope to see you in the next video.